Wyoming Territory, October 1879. The wind howled through the cottonwoods as the stagecoach rattled into the town of Willow Creek, its wheels cutting deep into the muddy road from last night's rain. Inside, tucked into the farthest corner, sat a young woman with her hands white-knuckled in her lap, staring out the window like she was watching for ghosts. Her name was Violet Deering, and she had run out of time. She stepped off the coach with stiff legs, her pale blue dress wrinkled from the long ride, her dark hair pinned neatly though a few strands had broken free. The town looked nothing like the letters had promised. No white fenced home waiting, no husband to be smiling near the depot. Just a few buildings hunched against the wind and a handful of strangers who barely looked up. She turned in a slow circle, clutching the telegram in her gloved hand. The man she was to marry, Henry Larch, had sent for her 6 weeks ago. Promised her a fresh start, a quiet ranch and a life away from the noise of St. Louis, but there was no sign of him here. "Miss," the voice came from behind her, low, steady, and kind. She turned to find a tall man in a worn canvas coat and a wide-brimmed hat. He looked to be in his late 20s, with deep-set eyes the color of river rock and a weathered gentleness in his face. He held his hat in one hand, hair ruffled from the wind. "I'm Boone Ellery," he said. "Henry Larch sent word last week. He's dead." "Shot in a card game up in Laramie." Violet's breath caught. "What?" Boone nodded, slow and apologetic. "I am sorry. I helped the sheriff pack his things, found the letter he'd been written you. Figured you'd still come, so I waited." Her knees buckled, but she caught herself on the post of the depot. I do not understand." Boone stepped closer but didn't crowd her. "He said you had no people left back east, that you were common to be his wife." She nodded, barely. "I sold everything to get here. Then you will not be out on the street, not while I got breath in my lungs." She blinked up at him. "Why would you help me? You do not even know me." He tucked his hat under his arm. "Because a man should not promise a woman safety and leave her with nothing. I got a cabin out on the edge of the valley. It is not much, but it is dry and warm. You can stay until you figure what comes next." Her voice trembled. "You do not have to do that, I know." He looked straight at her. "But I will." That night, Violet sat curled on the edge of Boone's hearth while rain whispered against the roof. The cabin was small but clean, with a braided rug near the fire and a row of books on the shelf. He had made her tea without asking, set it by her hands, then gone back to chopping wood outside to give her space. She watched him through the window. Every strike of the axe was measured and even. No waste, no anger, just quiet strength. When he came back in, soaked to the bone, he did not say a word, just took off his coat, wiped his boots, and nodded toward the hearth. "You can take the bed," he said. "I will sleep out here." "I cannot ask you to. You did not ask. I offered." She swallowed. "What if folks talk?" "Let them." He met her eyes again, and there was no heat in it, just calm. "You are safe here." She lay in his bed that night, unable to sleep, listening to the crackle of the fire and the faint rhythm of his breathing from the other room. Her chest ached. She had been so afraid of the journey, of the unknown man she was to marry, of what she would find. And now, in the strangest twist of all, the first real kindness she had known in a long time had come from a man who owed her nothing. The next morning, Boone was already outside, splitting logs before the sun had fully risen. Violet made coffee with shaking hands, unfamiliar with his kettle but determined to be useful. When he came in, she handed him a cup without a word. He took it, their fingers brushing for just a second. "Thank you," she nodded. "I do not know what I would have done if you had not been there." "You would have made it," he said. "I can see that in you." "No," she shook her head. "I would have broken." He set the cup down. "Then I am glad I was there." As the days passed, she helped him with small things, cooking, mending his shirts, sweeping the porch. He never once treated her like a burden, never asked for more than she gave. And slowly, the shaking in her hands stopped. One afternoon, they rode into town to pick up supplies. The sun was low in the sky, throwing long shadows over the hills, and the trees had turned gold and red with autumn. As they rode side by side, Violet glanced at him. "You never asked me why I came west to marry a stranger." Boone looked over. "You would tell me if you wanted." She stared ahead. "My father lost everything gambling. My mother died of sickness last year. I had nothing left." That letter from Henry. It felt like a way out. I am sorry about your folks. I am not. She looked down at the reins in her hands. He was not kind, she was tired. Boone was quiet a while, then said, "You are not alone anymore, Violet." She blinked at the tightness in her chest. "You say that like it is true. Because it is." They rode the rest of the way in silence. That evening, as the wind picked up and the smell of wood smoke filled the air, Boone sat whittling on the porch while Violet folded laundry. She watched him from the doorway, her arms full of linen, her heart aching in a way she did not understand. "Boone," he looked up. "What do you want from all this?" He set the carving down. "You mean life," she nodded. "I want quiet, land I can work, a woman to share it with. Someone who sees me." She felt her pulse thud. "You deserve that." His eyes met hers. "So do you." She stepped out onto the porch, the breeze tugging at her skirt. "I was afraid when I got off that coach. I was afraid of everything, I know. But I am not afraid now." He stood, slow and careful. "Good." She looked up at him, heart in her throat. Do you think you could ever see me that way, not just someone to help?" He reached out and touched her hand, gentle and warm. "I already do." The leaves rustled around them. The sky above stretched wide and endless, streaked in orange and gold. Violet let out a breath. "Then maybe I do belong here after all." Boone smiled, not with his mouth but with his whole face. "You always did." The morning after the first frost, Violet stood barefoot on the cabin's back stoop, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, apron damp from scrubbing. A thin line of smoke curled from the chimney behind her, the fire inside still warm from breakfast. Pale sunlight stretched across the hills, catching on frost-laced grass and the last stubborn leaves clinging to the aspen trees. Boone was in the pasture, coaxing a young bay that had come in skittish from the neighbor's herd. He'd agreed to break the horse in trade for winter hay, and Violet had watched him work the gelding every day since. He never raised his voice, never used a whip, just moved with quiet patience, drawing the animal's trust one step at a time. She crossed the yard with a biscuit wrapped in a cloth and leaned on the fence as he rubbed the horse's neck. "He's calmer today," she said. Boone glanced over his shoulder. "He let me touch his flank this morning, that's the first." She held out the cloth. "You didn't take anything when I called." He brushed his hands on his trousers before taking it. "Thank you, I always forget to eat when I'm out with a horse." Violet rested her chin on her arms. "You ever think about leaving this place?" He chewed slowly. "Once, back when I was 17. Thought I'd try Montana, but I never got farther than Cheyenne." "What stopped you?" "My brother got sick. I came back to help and never looked west again." She tilted her head. "You never speak of him." "He died that winter, just me now." He gave the horse a scratch behind the ears. "I buried him out past the ridge, marked it with a sugar pine." There was no sorrow in his voice, only a quiet respect. She watched him a moment, then glanced toward the distant hills. "I'd like to see where he rests." Boone nodded once. "I'll take you when the ground's dry again." Later that week, Boone brought in the last of the squash and turnips, and Violet preserved what she could in jars they'd traded for in town. She'd never done it herself before, but she followed the instructions in the book he'd left on the shelf, sealing each jar with careful hands. Boone built extra shelving near the root cellar, and when she thanked him, he just nodded and passed her another board. The rhythm of the days settled into something steady. She mended curtains that had gone threadbare and lined the inside of her boots with wool from an old blanket. Boone cleared a patch of brush along the edge of the cabin for a future garden, though he didn't say so outright. He just asked how deep she thought carrots needed soil. One evening, as dusk folded over the valley, Violet sat just inside the doorway darning a glove, her needle moving with slow concentration. Boone came in carrying a bundle of firewood and set it beside the stove. "Do you play?" he asked, nodding toward the shelf. She looked up. "Play what?" He pulled down a fiddle in a worn case. "This," she blinked. "I haven't seen one of those in years." "My mother played. She taught me some." He opened the case and ran his fingers over the strings, then tightened the pegs and lifted the bow. "Tell me if it sounds like a coyote dying." The first notes were hesitant but steady. The tune he chose was simple, something familiar but not mournful. Violet smiled, setting the glove aside. "You're better than you let on," she said. He didn't stop playing. "You sing," she hesitated. "Not since I was a girl." Try. She joined him on the second verse, voice unsure at first, then stronger. The song wove between them, rising and falling like wind through the trees. When it ended, Boone lowered the bow slowly. "You have a fine voice," he said. She met his eyes across the room. "I'd forgotten what it felt like." He set the fiddle back in its case. Some things come back when we least expect. The first snow came 2 days later. Not heavy, but enough to settle on the roof and drift against the shed. Boone spent the morning checking the fences while Violet patched a rip in the quilt they'd found stored in a trunk. By afternoon, the sky had cleared and the cold air carried the sharp, clean scent of pine. That night, he came in later than usual, cheeks red from wind. "Fence held," he said, peeling off his gloves. "Cattle'll stay close with the snow." She poured him a cup of broth. "I stitched up that quilt. It's warm again." He took the cup with both hands. "You've done more than I ever expected." She drew a chair closer to the fire. "You didn't expect anything." "That's true," he sipped, "but I'm grateful all the same." They sat in silence a while, the fire crackling between them. Then Violet said, "You said once you wanted someone who saw you." Boone looked over, quiet. "I think I do," she said. "Not everything, but enough to know." He set the cup down. "What do you see?" "A man who carries his promises like stones, who speaks little but means every word. Who made room for someone broken without asking why." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You're not broken, Violet." She gave a small, tired smile. "I was. You helped me remember how to stand again." Boone reached out, slow and careful, and took her hand. His thumb brushed over her knuckles, rough against soft. "I didn't do it alone," he said. She let her fingers curl around his. "No, you didn't." Outside, the snow began to fall again, soft and soundless. Inside, two people sat with hands joined, the space between them finally closed. By late November, the cold had settled deep into the earth. Ice slicked the edges of the creek, and the wind came down from the mountains sharp as glass. Boone had taken to rising before the sun, tending the animals and breaking up the water troughs with the back of his axe. Violet kept the fire banked high and wore wool stockings under her skirts. The quiet between them had grown companionable, filled with the small sounds of shared work. One morning, Boone returned from checking the traps he'd set near the ridge. He hung his coat by the door, the sleeves stiff with frost, and laid a hair on the table beside her sewing. "Caught clean," he said. "Won't waste any of it." She nodded and reached for the blade without hesitation. "You want stew or roast? I'll leave that to you." He leaned against the doorframe, watching her hands work with practiced calm. "You ever dress game before?" "No, but I watched my uncle do it a dozen times. He was the only one who never minded me standing close." Boone's gaze lingered. "You never talk about him." "He died when I was 12, she said, keeping her eyes on the meat. "Heart gave out during the second harvest. He had a slow way about him. Let the world come to him, not the other way around." "That sounds familiar." She looked up. "You're not slow, Boone." "You're steady, it's different," he straightened. "Suppose I'll take that as a compliment. You should." After supper, Boone brought in a narrow drawer from the barn. The wood had been sanded smooth, the corners joined clean. Violet set aside her knitting and ran her fingers over the dovetails. "What's it for?" she asked. "Shelf for your jars. Thought you'd want them where you could see 'em." Her mouth parted slightly, then closed again. "You made this for me," he shrugged, brushing sawdust from his sleeves. Seemed better than leaving them packed away. She looked at the drawer again, then at him. "It's beautiful. You're the one who filled it." That night, she couldn't sleep. The fire had burned low, casting faint light across the rafters. She sat up in bed and listened to the wind whistling between the chinks in the logs. On impulse, she rose, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and padded quietly to the main room. Boone was still awake, seated at the table with a ledger open before him. He looked up, surprised but not unsettled. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. "No," she moved closer. "Did I wake you?" "I was figuring winter feed, just lost track of time." She sat across from him. "It's strange, isn't it? How silence can feel different depending on who you share it with." Boone folded the ledger closed. "I've known silence that felt like punishment. This doesn't." She traced a knot in the tabletop. "I used to believe I wasn't meant for peace, that I'd never know what it felt like to be still and not afraid." His voice was low. "Do you feel afraid now?" She shook her head. "Not when I'm with you." Boone reached across the table, slow and deliberate, and laid his hand over hers. The warmth of it spread through her like spring thaw. "I never expected you," he said, "but I'm glad you came." Violet's throat tightened. "I spent so long preparing to be someone's wife, I never thought about what it might mean to be loved." He didn't speak at first, just held her hand like it was something precious. "I don't make promises easy," he said. "But the ones I do, I keep." She looked at him fully then, the firelight catching in her eyes. "Would you make another?" He stood and came around the table, kneeling beside her chair. His voice was quiet, steady. "If you'll have me, I'll give you a home that's yours in every way. I'll build it with my hands and fill it with the life you want. No debts, no fear, just us and the land and the days we earn together." Violet didn't answer right away. Her hand came to his cheek, thumb brushing the edge of his jaw. Then she leaned forward and kissed him soft, certain, without hesitation. When she pulled back, her voice was clear. "Yes, Boone, I'll have you." He rested his forehead against hers, eyes closed. "Then we'll begin tomorrow," and they did. The first Sunday in December came with low clouds and a hush to the air, like the sky was holding its breath. Boone hitched the wagon with heavier blankets and tied a cedar bough across the side rail at Violet's request. She stood nearby in a slate-colored shawl trimmed in ribbon she'd found in a trunk, her hair braided and pinned with care. "They'll be cutting the pie soon if we don't leave now," she said, watching as he tightened the final strap. Boone glanced up. "You sure you want to go? I've lived in this territory over a month and only seen the inside of the supplies shop and your pasture." She stepped closer. "I think it's time I met the folks you trade with." He handed her up into the wagon bed. "They're not fancy." "I'm not either." They rode into town with the wagon creaking steady beneath them, the road lined with bare trees and crows watching from fence posts. Willow Creek's gathering hall stood at the far end of Main Street, its roof patched with tin and smoke curling from the chimney. Inside, the air buzzed with voices and the scent of roasted pork and cinnamon. Candles flickered on every windowsill. Boone helped her down and offered his arm. She took it without hesitation. A few heads turned as they stepped inside, but no one spoke. Violet kept her chin level, watching the room without flinching. Boone led her toward the tables, where a tall woman with crow-black hair and a dress stitched from flour sacks greeted them with a nod. "Boone Ellery," she said, hands on her hips. "Didn't think I'd see you in here unless someone dragged you by the collar." Boone tipped his hat. "Miss Gentry, this is Violet Deering." The woman looked Violet over once, then smiled. "You brought something finer than venison this time." Violet extended her hand. "It's kind of you to host." Miss Gentry shook it firmly. "We take turns. This week's mine. You want cider, it's by the stove. And be warned, the preacher's wife will ask how many jars you've canned." They found seats near the hearth, and soon the warmth and noise of the gathering wrapped around them. Boone spoke little, as always, but Violet found herself answering questions with ease. Yes, the cabin was snug. Yes, she'd helped with the meat. Yes, she planned to plant beans come spring. After the meal, when the trestle tables had been cleared and children were chasing each other in socked feet, Boone stepped outside for air. Violet followed a few minutes later, wrapping her shawl tighter. He stood near the rail, watching the snow begin to fall in thin, drifting lines. "Too much noise?" she asked. He didn't look over. "Not used to folks anymore. Takes time to settle back into it." She rested her hands on the rail. "They were kind. They can be once they know you. You think they will?" He turned then, slow and thoughtful. "They already started." She studied his profile, the slight downward tilt of his mouth, the way his fingers curled over the wood. "You were watching me," she said. "I was making sure you were all right." "I was," he nodded once. "You carry yourself different now." She looked toward the dark horizon. "I feel like my old self is still out there somewhere, walking the trails behind me, but she's lighter now, like she knows I'm safe." Boone stepped closer. "You don't have to leave her behind." "I think I do," she said, turning toward him. "She made it here, but she can't stay." The snow clung to his shoulders, melting slowly into the wool. "Then let her rest. You've earned that." Violet reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. "When we go home, I'd like to make a place for the fiddle by the window, and I want to hang my dress near the stove so I can wear it again on Christmas. That is, if you still want Christmas with me." Boone looked at her fully, his voice low and steady. "Violet, I want every winter with you. And every spring after." She stepped into his arms, her cheek against the rough wool of his coat. He held her there, not like someone afraid to lose her, but like someone who knew she was already his. The snow thickened around them, soft and silent. Behind the hall's window, candlelight danced against the glass, but neither noticed. They stood there until the cold reached their boots, then walked home together, side by side, along the same road that had once brought her there alone. The snow deepened through December, blanketing the valley in silence. Boone built a sled to haul wood from the timberline, and Violet began stitching a new dress from calico she'd traded for with her preserves. Each stitch was careful, each fold deliberate, the rhythm of her needle coaxing quiet joy to the surface. One afternoon, she stood on the porch brushing snow from a basket of dried herbs when she saw Boone near the barn, hammering something into the ground. She stepped down, boots crunching through the powder until she reached him. "You've been at it since sunup," she said, brushing a curl of hair from her cheek. He straightened, his breath puffing white. "Setting posts for a lean-to. I figured we'd need a place to store tools come spring." She looked at the neat row of stakes. "You said we," Boone met her eyes, "because it is." She nodded once, heart steady. "I've never had a say in building anything before, you will hear." That evening, Violet brought out a small square of muslin she'd kept folded in the bottom of her trunk. She spread it on the table and smoothed the corners. "My mother stitched this when she was a girl," she said. "It's all I have of her that's worth keeping." Boone leaned in, studying the faded threadwork. "Did she teach you how to sew?" "No, but I watched her hands often enough to learn." She folded the cloth again. "I'd like to sew our names beside hers, if you'd let me." He didn't speak right away. Then he reached across and touched the edge of the fabric. "I'd be honored." They married 3 days before Christmas beneath the arbor of bare cottonwoods behind the cabin. Miss Gentry brought cinnamon bread still warm from her oven, and the neighbor's boy played a fiddle tune that wavered but held true. The preacher from the next township rode in through the snow and read the vows with a voice rough from cold. Violet wore her new dress, soft blue with a sash at the waist, and Boone, in his one good shirt, held her hand as if he'd never let it go. When the preacher asked if they would take each other for the length of their days, Violet didn't hesitate. "I will," she said, voice clear as creek water. Boone's answer was quiet but certain. "I will." They signed their names in the cabin's Bible that night, the ink still wet as the fire crackled low. Boone ran his thumb over the curve of her wrist as she leaned against him. "We'll build slow," he said. "But we'll build true." Violet rested her head on his shoulder. "That's all I ever wanted." As winter deepened, the cabin settled into a rhythm that belonged only to them. Boone carved shelves for her sewing and strung hooks above the hearth for drying herbs. Violet mended his gloves and made tea from the wild mint she'd gathered before snowfall. They read aloud from the books he'd kept on the shelf, her voice smooth, his low and steady, and spent long evenings in the hush of lamplight, speaking little but feeling everything. One morning in late February, Boone came in with a sprig of green in his hand. "Snow's melting off the south ridge," he said. "Found these coming up through the moss." Violet took the sprig and cupped it in her palms. Spring's coming. They stood by the window, watching the light shift over the thawing earth. Outside, the land waited. Inside, their lives had already begun, years passed, slow and quiet. Boone built the lean-to, then added a room off the back of the cabin for Violet's sewing. She planted beans the first spring, then carrots and onions, and by the 4th season, the garden stretched nearly to the fence. They hosted neighbors for suppers never more than could fit around the table, and Violet taught 2 local girls how to stitch clean seams. Boone broke horses for the neighboring ranchers and took Violet riding when the weather held. They never spoke much about the lives they'd had before there was no need. What mattered was the life they shared. The soft creak of the porch boards beneath their boots, the hush of snowfall on the roof, the weight of her hand in his each night before sleep. One autumn, Boone built a cradle from pine and lined it with wool. Violet sat beside him as he worked, her hands folded over her middle, a quiet smile touching her mouth. When their daughter came small and strong, with Boone's steady gaze and Violet's quick grip, they named her Clara, for the stillness of the morning she was born. And so the days unfolded, gentle and unhurried. The cabin remained tucked into the valley, smoke curling from its chimney, the wind brushing through the cottonwoods. Inside, love lived not in grand moments, but in the quiet ones, in the way Boone brushed snow from her shoulders, in the way Violet laid a hand to his back as he read, in the way they knew each other's silences and filled them with presence. They grew older together, their hands worn but sure. And through each season, each turn of the earth, they remained what they had always been to one another: home.